A flight on the brink of disaster. The captain suffers a heart attack, and the plane spirals out of control. Panic sets in, a fight for survival is about to begin. Who is the silent hero? And what will it take to make it through? The plane's last chance to land is running out. Please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us for more exciting adventures. Thank you. The city had been engulfed in the flames of hell for 3 days. The flames danced with the wind from every direction, devouring the buildings one by one, and the sky had been bathed in red and gray tones for days. Hundreds of firefighters, volunteers, and rescue teams had fought tirelessly to bring the fire under control. Water tankers, hoses that emptied without stopping, and screams mixed with the sound of sirens. Everyone and everything had been mobilized to stop this deadly fire. Finally, the fire had been extinguished, but all that remained were streets smelling of smoke, skeleton-like buildings, and a layer of ash blown by the wind. The city was in ruins. However, the effects of this disaster were not limited to burned homes or lost lives. The clouds of ash and dust that mixed with the sky had paralyzed air traffic in the city. Visibility had dropped to dangerously low levels, and flights at the airport were cancelled one after another. The terminal buildings had become the new center of chaos. Passengers struggling in frustration were arguing with airline officials on the verge of a breakdown, and the endless announcements only made the impatient wait harder. Delayed flights, lost luggage, and desperate looks showed another life destroyed not by the fire itself, but by its aftermath. But flights had to resume at some point. As the wait stretched on, the pressure on the airline companies was increasing. The system, normally bound by strict procedures, was now beginning to bend. Rules were being ignored, risks were being taken without calculation, and security protocols were being pushed aside one by one. Now, the goal was not just to transport passengers safely but to restart the flights as soon as possible and get the system moving again. And this was exactly why Flight 407 had to take off without a co-pilot. Captain Daniel Reeves took a deep breath inside the cockpit and glanced over the control panels once again. The indicators of the Boeing 737 were glowing as usual, but some of them now signified more than just a warning. His eyes were fixed on the red light indicating that the autopilot system was disabled. No matter how hard he tried, that light wouldn't go out. Just like the unease inside him. The company's sudden decision was still bothering him. It was extremely unusual for a plane to take off without a co-pilot, and Reeves knew how big a risk that was. But with the added issue of the autopilot being down, the risk was growing exponentially. There was a golden rule in aviation: safety first. But the crisis of the past few days had led to that rule being bent. He lifted his head and looked out the windshield, where the long strip of runway was lit by dim lights. He slowly placed his hands on the controls and took a deep breath. He was alone. No co-pilot, no autopilot, but all the responsibility rested on his shoulders. The Boeing 737 would start accelerating down the runway in a few minutes. Max was sitting in a corner of the terminal, exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness, and his face showed the marks of fatigue. At 45 years old, he was a retired soldier and a former combat pilot. Throughout the years he spent in the sky, he had been on countless dangerous missions, walking on the edge of death. But now, despite the weight of his past, all he wanted was to go home. His clothes were a mess. The ash that had stained the cuffs of his pants, the dust and dried mud on his jacket were silent witnesses to what he had endured over the last 3 days. He had been in the city since the first day of the fire, and just watching from a corner hadn't been enough for him. After all the years spent fighting danger, he couldn't do anything but act. He had joined the volunteer firefighters, rescued people trapped under debris, and carried heavy hoses. He was exhausted, drained, but he had done everything he could. Now, after 3 days of chaos, he had finally boarded a plane. As he sat down in his seat, he took a deep breath, feeling a slight sense of relief. He was going home. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes. silence and peace. That's all he needed. He just wanted to sit for a few hours without thinking about anything, without doing anything. At that moment, a young flight attendant from the cabin crew was serving drinks to the passengers. She bent down with graceful movements, asking questions in a soft voice and responding to requests. She leaned slightly toward the passenger beside Max and, with a smile, asked, "Sir, can I get you a drink?" The passenger next to him lifted his head and smiled faintly. "Thank you, orange juice please," he replied. The flight attendant nodded with a sweet smile and gently noted the passenger's order. But just as she turned away, her eyes inadvertently shifted toward Max. For a moment, her expression changed. She furrowed her brows slightly, her lips curled into a faint frown. Her gaze lingered on Max's ash-covered clothes and the dust on his hands. She wrinkled her nose, and a hint of contempt appeared on her face. She didn't say a word to him. She didn't ask him a question or even greet him. As if Max wasn't even sitting there, she quickly moved away. Max opened his eyes and quietly took a deep breath. Trying to maintain his composure, he gently stopped the flight attendant with a soft voice. "Could I have a glass of water?" he asked. The flight attendant turned and looked at him. Her eyes seemed to freeze for a moment, as if she had just noticed Max was there. She raised her eyebrows slightly, and a faint expression of discomfort appeared on her face. Then, in a forced tone, she responded, "Of course." But she didn't come back, nor did she bring the water. Max waited silently for a few minutes. The passenger beside him had already received his drink, and the other passengers were being served. But his glass was still nowhere to be seen. He took a deep breath, maintaining his patience, and spoke again. This time, his voice was firmer. "Excuse me. My water?" The flight attendant returned, her eyes once again scanning Max from top to bottom. She sighed, then nodded vaguely before walking away with an indifferent attitude. Minutes later, she finally came back, holding a small plastic cup. But the cup was only half full. The water inside was barely enough compared to what the other passengers had been given. As she handed the cup to Max, she kept it at arm's length, careful not to let her fingertips touch it, as if it might get dirty. "Here you go," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. Max took the water, gripping the cold surface of the cup with his fingers. He opened his mouth to say something, but then stopped. It wasn't worth getting into an argument. But the anger inside him was quietly growing. He had dedicated his whole life to helping others. He had fought for it, lost friends, and faced death. But now, even a glass of water seemed too much for him to ask for. Captain Daniel Reeves took a deep breath inside the cockpit and focused his eyes on the indicators in front of him. He hoped that Flight 407 would proceed smoothly, but concern still lingered in the back of his mind. He was flying alone, the autopilot was offline, and the traces of the fire in the air hadn't completely disappeared. Still, for now, everything seemed to be okay. After takeoff, the weather wasn't as bad as he had feared. The turbulence was minimal, and visibility was better than expected. The ashes from the fire still tinted the sky in a pale gray, but it didn't pose a significant obstacle to the flight. Reeves took a few deep breaths and relaxed slightly. Maybe this flight wouldn't be as stressful as he had imagined. However, just a few minutes later, a strange sensation began to spread through his body. At first, he felt a slight weight in his left arm. He didn't think much of it, as it was something he frequently experienced on long flights. A tiring day, muscle fatigue. He tried to relieve it by shifting his shoulder a few times. But soon, the sensation spread to his neck. The pain started as a mild pressure, then gradually intensified. Reeves tried to understand what was happening as he took another deep breath. He brought his hand up to his neck and gently rubbed it with his fingers. Deep down, he thought that the stress of flying the plane alone might be causing this. After all, when the mind tenses, the body reacts as well. Perhaps it was just a tension headache. But instead of fading, the pain was deepening. For a moment, he noticed a thin layer of sweat forming on his forehead. There was a strange, yet mild, tightness in the left side of his chest. He swallowed, but his throat felt dry. His hands instinctively clenched into loose fists. This sensation was familiar to him, but he didn't want to think about it right now. He reached forward to the panel, pressed a button, and activated the intercom. "Cabin crew, this is the captain. Could I get a glass of water?" There was a few seconds of silence over the intercom, then the flight attendant's voice came through. "I'll bring it right away, Captain." Reeves leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The pressure in his chest was increasing slightly, but he reassured himself that it wasn't anything major. It had been a tiring day, a tense flight, and long-standing stress. This had to be just a sign of fatigue. The cabin of the plane looked completely ordinary from the outside. Passengers had settled into their seats, and the cabin crew had finished their service. The rhythmic hum of the engines mixed with the buzz inside the cabin, creating the impression that everything was proceeding as usual. But for Max, this journey was anything but ordinary. He hadn't had a decent night's sleep in 3 days. After helping with the fire, his body was on high alert, every muscle ached, and with every breath, his chest burned. But none of it bothered him. He was used to pain. Throughout his life, he had learned to push physical discomfort aside. But now, he couldn't control his body. His eyelids grew heavy, and his thoughts started to blur. The constant vibration of the plane's engines numbed his mind, pulling him toward another time, another life. The sounds in his ears faded, slipping deeper into his subconscious, until at some point, he completely lost touch with reality. Then, he heard a sound. A radio static. But it wasn't coming from the plane. This voice was from a much older time, a much different place. Target coordinates entered. "Are all pilots ready?" For a moment, he found himself back in the cockpit. But this was a fighter jet cockpit. His eyes snapped open, but what he saw was not the screens of the plane, it was the scenes painted in the sky by the memories of the past. He could hear his own breath inside the helmet. The sky was a deep blue, but down below, chaos reigned. The radio calls echoing in his ears, the high-pitched hum of the engines, the voices of his comrades, everything felt so familiar that, for a moment, he truly believed he was there. But he wasn't. Now, he was sitting in a passenger seat. Even with his eyes closed, the line between reality and dream was growing thinner. In his sleep, he was disappearing into the shadows of the past. The flight attendant carefully placed the glass of water on the tray in the plane's galley. The day seemed never-ending. Passengers were restless, the atmosphere inside the cabin was tense, and everyone seemed to carry the traces of the fire. She was constantly in a rush, as though time itself had stopped. She longed for the plane to land and for the long day to finally come to an end. With the tray in hand, she walked toward the cockpit. The captain's voice over the intercom sounded normal, so there was no immediate cause for concern. But when she opened the cockpit door and stepped inside, she paused for a brief moment when she saw Reeves' face. There were small beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His eyes looked slightly distant. "Here you go, Captain," the flight attendant said, placing the glass on the space in front of him. Reeves gave a faint smile and nodded. "Thank you," he said, reaching for the glass. However, the flight attendant noticed his fingers were slightly trembling. She thought he looked tired, but didn't question it. After all, everyone had been on their feet for hours. She quickly exited the cockpit, returning to her duties. Reeves picked up the glass and took a few sips. The water brought a slight sense of relief as it slid down his throat. But that feeling lasted only a few seconds. Just as he was holding the glass in his hand, he suddenly felt a cramp in his left arm. His brows furrowed, and reflexively, he reached for his arm, but the movement caused the glass to slip from his hand. The glass fell to the cockpit floor, and the water quickly spread across the surface. At the same moment, he felt a pressure in his chest. A light but uncomfortable weight. His heart was beating irregularly. He took a deep breath, trying to focus on the control panel in front of him. His hands reached toward the buttons, but he felt a slight numbness in his fingers. He whispered to himself, "Focus, Reeves." But instead of easing, the pressure in his chest only intensified. And Flight 407 was about to be pulled into a major crisis. When the flight attendant returned to collect the empty glass, she noticed the pallor on Captain Daniel Reeves' face but assumed it was just fatigue. However, Reeves' body had started sending signals. He felt an intense pressure on the left side of his chest, as if someone were squeezing his ribcage from the inside. "Ah!" He groaned softly, suddenly bringing his hand to his chest. The pain radiating down his left arm was nearly unbearable. His neck felt like it was on fire. Just as the flight attendant was about to turn around, Reeves' face turned bright red, and the sweat on his forehead intensified. "I'm having a heart attack," the captain shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No autopilot. Alert the passengers. We're over the ocean, life vests ready." The flight attendant froze. For a few seconds, she didn't know what to do. "Come on, hurry up," the captain groaned, reaching for the buttons with trembling hands, but his fingers were losing their function. The flight attendant, eyes wide with panic, bolted out of the cockpit. Inside the cabin, everything still seemed calm. Passengers were sitting comfortably, some watching movies, others sleeping. But that calm would shatter in just a few seconds. She took a deep breath, then pressed the announcement button, shouting into the cabin, "Attention! Attention! Emergency situation!" The passengers immediately turned their heads, murmurs rising. "Our captain is experiencing a medical emergency. Please prepare your life vests without panicking. We're over the ocean." But staying calm was no longer an option. Shouts began to rise. A woman screamed. A man jumped to his feet and shouted, "What do you mean the captain is sick?" A few passengers quickly reached for the overhead compartments, scrambling to find their life vests. At that moment, the plane started to tilt slightly. Normally, with the autopilot engaged, the plane would stay on a stable course. But now, there was no one to keep it steady. The plane began to lean to the right. As panic in the cabin grew, Max opened his eyes. Amid the screams in the cabin, Max suddenly jolted awake. He had jumped out of sleep, but his instincts kicked in immediately. With his military training, he quickly scanned his surroundings. The flight attendants were in a panic. The passengers were in chaos. Within seconds, he understood what was happening. Something's wrong. The passenger next to him turned to him in a panic. "The pilot's sick," they whispered. "There's no pilot on the plane." Max sat up straight in his seat and looked at one of the flight attendants, rushing frantically through the cabin. That flight attendant. The same woman who had looked down on him, bringing him water with contempt, ignoring his presence. Now she was out of breath and in a panic. Max spoke in a strong, clear voice. "I'm a pilot." The flight attendant stared at him, her eyes wide, as if trying to understand what Max had just said. Then her brows furrowed. "Don't joke with me, you crazy man," she shouted. "This is not the time." Fear had completely consumed her eyes. Max's face remained expressionless, but inside, anger was rising. The irony of this woman, who had once belittled him, now desperately searching for a hero, wasn't lost on him. At that moment, another flight attendant, a younger woman trembling with fear, clung to Max's arm. "Sir, please, can you help the captain? Come to the cockpit before it gets worse." This was what Max had been waiting for. He immediately stood up and began walking toward the cockpit. When Max entered the cockpit, the captain's face was pale. His breathing was irregular, and he was holding his chest, pressing with his hands. At that moment, a passenger rushed inside. "I'm a doctor," he shouted, grabbing the captain's arm and checking his pulse. "His heart rate is irregular, I need to intervene immediately," he added. Max realized within seconds that there was no longer a single pilot on board. "Do everything you can to save the captain," he said to the doctor. "I'm taking over the plane." As the doctor began performing chest compressions on the captain, Max immediately sat down in the pilot's seat. This wasn't a fighter jet. The controls were completely different. He put on the headset. His hands rested on the panel. For a few seconds, he tried to make sense of the indicators. But at that moment, the plane suddenly started to tilt to the left. Max quickly placed his hands on the controls. The chaos was just beginning. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 407. Our captain is having a heart attack. I'm taking control of the plane, but the system is unfamiliar to me. Requesting emergency guidance." There was nothing but static over the radio for a few seconds. Then, a calm voice came from the control tower. "Flight 407, we hear you. Keep control. What's your name?" "I'm Max, former fighter pilot." Tower, "Alright, Max, listen carefully. This passenger aircraft responds differently. Don't make sharp movements with the controls, make small adjustments. First, you need to correct the tilt to the right gradually." Max gritted his teeth. "Got it, I'm trying." He slowly moved his hand toward the controls. He was used to sharp movements in fighter jets, but everything here was heavier and more delicate. With a small but careful move, he tried to straighten the plane. For a moment, the plane's shaking stopped. But it only lasted a few seconds. One of the engines slightly wobbled, and the plane jolted again. The screams in the cabin returned. Max sucked in a breath, muttering, "Focus, Max." The radio crackled again, "Great job, Max. Now focus on maintaining the flight level. We've checked your route, the nearest landing point is Bermuda International Airport. You need to prepare for an emergency landing. We'll gradually reduce your altitude. We're with you." Max listened to the instructions coming through his headset while keeping an eye on the chaos inside the plane. The passengers were gradually starting to calm down. They knew that someone was in control of the plane now. But fear still lingered. One man shouted, "Is the pilot alive?" One of the flight attendants responded, "The doctor is working on the captain, we're doing everything we can." Max glanced toward the other corner of the cockpit, where the captain lay. The doctor was still performing chest compressions, but Reeves' condition was critical. Max turned back to the radio. "I need to land at Bermuda Airport, understood. What about the wind conditions? Landing gear?" "Tower, the wind is light from the east, align with runway 09. Your landing gear should be functional, but you'll need to adjust your speed carefully. We'll guide you in for the landing." Max took a deep breath. This plane was different from the ones he was used to, but flying was still instinctive for him. "Okay," he said. Starting to descend for the landing. As the runway approached, the wind picked up a bit more. The plane was gently swaying. The radio crackled to life, "You're doing great, Max. Now you need to slow down. Gradually deploy the brakes and flaps." Max followed the commands, but the plane started to drift slightly due to the wind. The passengers screamed again. "Radio, slowly, slowly. Deploy the landing gear." Max gritted his teeth and pressed the landing gear button. A brief hum was heard, and the indicator on the panel lit up, signaling that the landing gear was deployed. "Okay. Landing gear is down." The voice from the radio responded excitedly, "Great job, Max. Now keep the landing angle steady. The runway is waiting for you, keep slowing down." The plane was speeding toward the runway lights. In the final moments, Max held his breath. His whole body was tense with anticipation. I'm going to make it. The plane hit the runway hard. Boom! Everyone clung to their seats. Smoke rose from the wheels as the plane wobbled for a moment. Max quickly engaged the brakes, trying to slow the plane down along the runway. And finally, the plane came to a complete stop. The cabin was silent for a few seconds. Then, a passenger screamed, and applause erupted throughout the plane. People were crying, hugging each other. Max let out a deep breath. The voice from the radio was smiling, "Congratulations, Flight 407. You made the landing. Great job." The plane had finally landed safely at Bermuda International Airport. When the doors opened, Captain Reeves was the first to be rushed to the ambulance. Doctors quickly examined him, gathering information about his condition. The passengers began to disembark, but there was a mix of chaos and relief in the air. Max sat in the cockpit for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. He had done it. He had landed the plane and saved the captain. But the anger inside him hadn't fully faded. The flight attendant's condescending attitude still lingered in his mind. As Max walked out of the cockpit, he noticed the flight attendant who had belittled him. She was standing in front of the plane's door, looking at him with eyes filled with fear and regret. Max's eyes met hers, and there was a moment of silence. She had to look away. In that instant, Max knew everything had changed. He saw the fear and regret in her eyes, but it didn't matter. Because now, he was his own hero. He had kept people alive, given them hope. As Max stepped off the plane, he was met with a barrage of media attention. Camera flashes blinded him, and reporters fired questions one after another. Everyone knew him as the heroic former fighter pilot. "Max, how did you stay so calm during the flight? How did you manage such a major crisis? You saved so many lives, how does that make you feel?" Bombarded with questions, Max quickly distanced himself from the crowd. But the police pushed past the media and moved in to escort him away, ensuring he was safely removed from the chaos. The officers shielded him as they led him away from the throngs of people, allowing him to move away from the cameras. As Max made his way toward his home, he gradually drifted further from the crowd, feeling a sense of calm return as he distanced himself from the frenzy. The airline had failed to take the necessary precautions to ensure the safety of Captain Reeves and the passengers. However, Max immediately became the talk of the news, hailed as a heroic former fighter pilot. The company was forced to compensate both the captain and Max for their bravery in saving the lives of the passengers. Max had saved the lives of 102 passengers and had finally returned home. Many people were applauding his heroism. But for Max, the greatest reward was simply returning home in peace. All that remained was the quiet comfort of his conscience. A hero, though he knew it himself, acts without waiting for others' approval. And Max had always been that kind of person. Max had accomplished the greatest feat of his life. He had kept the passengers alive and safely landed the plane. Now, it was time to return home. And perhaps, he had left the greatest battle of his life behind him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Join us for more exciting adventures.